question.
What's your question?
My question is, how could one explain to another person, or how does one correctly assess if somebody has repented towards me or I have repented towards them? Or about a general issue, a single issue? What is the definition?
Well, my belief
how does one assess it?
My belief is that aside from your personal circumstances, without involving God in the situation, you're not going to be able to assess it.
So you are saying, though, that I have repented about things.
You have, because otherwise you would never have reached the sixth dimension.
Without God's involvement.
That's right. So you would never have gotten into your current condition without going through a process of repentance and forgiveness at some level. But you just haven't involved God in the process at any time. And therefore, you don't yet understand that some of the things you've already repented for, only God can really fix. Only God's laws can really fix. Right? But also, there's things that are specifically being done in your relationship between you and God that are not fixed. If they were fixed, you would already be in the seventh sphere. They just haven't been fixed yet.
Yes, and I'm not opposed to that.
That's right. And what I'm getting at is that the big issue here, I feel, is the issue of the conscience. You've heard me speak about the conscience. The beauty of the conscience is that God has has inbuilt into the soul the mechanism of allowing you to hear from God about what you have fixed and what you haven't fixed. In other words, the person who constructed the universal laws is able to personally tell you when the process of repentance is complete. And that's when you'll know it's complete.
I see. So only through that mechanism can one correctly assess such a thing.
That's right.
It's not a math. I mean, I understand there is maths. There must be a mathematical way of knowing.
Of course.
But that's not something that you could
You
share.
won't even understand the maths without God's help, actually. So the maths are too complicated for a sixth sphere spirit to understand. So this is another part of the problem, is that as a sixth sphere spirit, there's a tendency to want to involve yourself in the maths and the physics of the discovery. But the problem is your level of understanding of the maths and the physics requires certain functionings of the soul that are only opened by the inflow of God's love into the soul. And so therefore it's sort of like a catch-22. You can never resolve the maths because you haven't got the understanding to resolve the maths, because the mechanism that gives you the understanding, you're preventing from entering you. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand.
So yes, you're right. There is the mathematical reasons why all of this occurs, but you're not really going to understand all the mathematical reasons because you've yet to connect to the source of the way to open up the soul, to open up the soul's development enough to understand the maths. So this is the problem of not having the relationship with God, is it prevents us from fully understanding everything. And as you know, in the past, there's been times when you've studied something and you feel, as I said to the sixth sphere group, with Sebastian's group, you feel a completion to a process. And then in the sixth sphere, there's times when you try to investigate something fully, but it's like there's a lot of unknowable things. There's a lot of things you can't seem to know. And it's not because God doesn't want to, or let's say the universe doesn't want to share it with you. It's because there's a blockage inside of oneself, inside of the soul, that prevents the knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's where the limitations of the sixth dimension start to impose themselves upon each individual who lives there.
So we have this option then of experimenting with the conscience.
Yes, two things. I feel experimenting with the mechanism of the conscience, which is the inbuilt mechanism that God has to share truth with you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to experiment with the flow of love between you and God. So at this stage, while you have what I'd classify as an intellectual concept of God, or a potential one, there hasn't been a personal experience with that God where you can feel the two of you in communication with each other. And without that experience, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand what can be shared with you. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense in principle, yes.
So the basic principle from a scientific perspective is that we need a substance from God to understand how not having a relationship with God has damaged us. Does that make sense? And from a scientific perspective, while there are mathematical and physics-based formulas that can govern the operation of that, it's better to understand it from an emotional perspective because it's much simpler for a start. And the mathematics will come to you after you've gone through the emotion of it.
Okay. Well, thank you for your help.